I entitled my remarks, Make America Promethean Again. Now, embedded in that, I suspect are a number of questions. The first for some of you might be, what is Promethean? But I think it's also worth really considering, what is America? And, I don't just mean, I'm proud to be an American for all of the appropriate things that we sing in that song, but really a deeper understanding of where this nation came from and why it is so absolutely precious and must be preserved. And then, of course, the question is, well, were we Promethean at one time? And what is the process by which we will make America Promethean again? So I hope in the course of today's discussions, people come away with a deeper understanding of those questions and at least a beginning idea of what the answers are to those questions. So let me just start by identifying a number of figures, living and dead, who are Prometheans. Benjamin Franklin was known as the American Promethean. The man whom many of us worked with for many years, Lyndon LaRouche, was a modern-day Promethean, and he considered himself very much so. Donald Trump is a Promethean in many ways, and the only chance for this nation and perhaps mankind to survive is to put this Promethean political figure back into the White House. But I want to start with the question of what is Promethean? Who is Prometheus? Prometheus, the great Greek classical dramatist Aeschylus, wrote a trilogy about Prometheus in 450 BC. So these are ideas that even predate the Christian era. These are ideas that go way back in human history. We only have the first of the three trilogies, which is called Prometheus Bound. And it's in Prometheus Bound that there are two very important concepts which, to me, reflect why we chose the name Promethean. The first is the need to protect mankind's ability to act on and transform nature with the gift of fire. Lyndon LaRouche often commented, and it's such a simple idea, but when you realize it hits you. Man is the only species which is not afraid of fire. We harness it, we use it, we develop it. Animals run away from it. So this idea of Prometheus taking fire from the gods on Mount Olympus, from Zeus, and giving it to mankind so that we could harness it, so that we could develop. This captures, I think, a fundamental principle which we'll be exploring throughout the day in our discussions. Now, Zeus and the Olympians, just like today's elites, are really not happy with mankind progressing and people who lead them and protect them in that progress. So Prometheus was punished by Zeus. Adam, could you put up the first slide? Because the Olympian gods, just as the elites today, they want to deprive us of the gifts of reason. They want to deprive us of the ability to advance. If that causes you to think about the green agenda, it should. And again, the second very powerful concept in Aeschylus's Prometheus is the fact that Prometheus was punished. Zeus chained him to a rock for eternity because Prometheus was an immortal. He broke from the gods to act on behalf of mankind. And so every night Zeus sent an eagle to pick out his liver, but because he was immortal, it grew back, and the torture went on forever. That was Zeus's punishment. Now, you can all conjure up images of Alvin Bragg and Jack Smith and Judge Marchand and others, when you think about this kind of perpetual torture. And I really don't have to make the obvious comparison to what these people are doing to Donald Trump. But there are many other figures throughout history who have been persecuted or killed for the same reason as Prometheus. If you just want to leapfrog through the centuries, Johannes Kepler, the great astronomer, Joan of Arc, Edgar Allan Poe, who was not only a great poet, but an American intelligence officer. Of course, our presidents who have been murdered: Abraham Lincoln, William McKinley, John Kennedy. And if people haven't seen our dossier, it is the British who murder our presidents. It's at the literature table over there. But of course, also, Christian civilization was born of the sacrifice of Jesus Christ, and it was carried forward by his apostles, who were persecuted, and many of them were jailed. So I'll come back to Prometheus and his story in a minute. But I want to take up the next question, which is, what is America? I think that question will be interwoven throughout many of the presentations today, especially the two that follow me with Barbara and Bob. But I want to refer to one of my favorite speeches from Lyndon LaRouche, which he delivered in the year 2000, I believe, on America's manifest destiny, where he traced the origins of our nation back to the Greek classics, of which Aeschylus is a part, to Plato, to the mission of Jesus Christ, through the 15th century Renaissance, to the shores of America in the 17th century. And he identified a thread which connects all of these figures and periods. Next slide, Adam. I'm just going to quote from this, and it's on the screen, because I think it is one of the most condensed and powerful encapsulations which Mr. LaRouche gave us of this idea. He said, "The idea is that man is not an animal. Man, unlike any other species, is capable of willfully increasing our species' power in and over the universe. This is possible because we have a power which is called, technically, cognition, the power to discover universal physical and other principles, to prove that those principles are correct, and to apply those principles in ways which enable us to increase man's power in and over the universe, and to improve the conditions of life of the human being. And thus we must have a society fit, a form of society fit for that quality of creature cast in the image of the Creator." And that is what animated our founding fathers. That is what animated the creation of a republic. They gave us a form of government which is a republic and not a democracy. And it's a republic because we acknowledge there are universal principles, and that if you violate them, your society will pay a price. That is not democracy. That is not libertarianism, where you can do anything you want. But rather, it's an affirmative freedom to use our God-given powers of creativity to discover universal principles that are embedded in the universe, and then act on these principles to exert greater dominion over nature. So I want to turn to what I consider one of Donald Trump's greatest speeches, which he delivered in January 2020, like a different universe, pre-COVID. Right before the outbreak of COVID, he went to Davos. He went to the World Economic Forum. He went into the lion's den, and he confronted them directly. And he challenged their bestial conception of mankind. He challenged their pessimism, the fact that they are doomsayers, the fact that they are environmentalists, which by nature is pessimistic. You put up slide 3. And I just have a few excerpts from his statement, but I think in the hustle and bustle of the fights over issues and reacting to the insanity of the enemy, we sometimes forget these more overarching principles for which we fight. And I know, I'm sure, that this is what animates Donald Trump and keeps him going under the incredible attacks that he's under. He said in the speech to the Davos crowd, "But the wonders of the last century will pale in comparison to what today's young innovators will achieve, because they're doing things that nobody even thought feasible. We will continue to embrace technology, not shun it. When people are free to innovate, millions will live longer, happier, healthier lives." And when you think about that magnificent launch of the SpaceX Super Heavy the other day, you really do get a feel for this. I mean, when I was looking at it, I was thinking of the question of fire. Because if you look at that huge rocket, and what is it, 32 engines? And it just, I mean, that is what we mean by taming the gift of fire, you know, to be able to explore God's universe. But then in this speech, Donald Trump turned to the past. And if you could put up slide 4. And he referenced something which is very near and dear to many of us who worked with Lyndon LaRouche. He referenced something which was built centuries ago, and the quote is, "Centuries ago, at the time of the Renaissance, skilled craftsmen and laborers looked upwards. They built the structures that still touch the human heart. In Italy, citizens once started construction on what would be a 140-year project." Now, it wasn't a 140-year project because they had environmental restrictions. That's why things take so long today. But it's because I'll let him get to the punchline on this. In Italy, in Italy, the citizens once started construction on what would be a 140-year project, the Duomo of Florence, an incredible, incredible place. While the technology did not yet exist to complete their design, city fathers forged ahead anyway, certain that they would figure it out someday. These citizens of Florence did not expect limits to their high aspirations, and so the Great Dome was finally built. The next slide, Adam. Here's just a bigger picture of it. This dome is huge, and we're talking about something that was built in the early part of the 15th century and the latter part of the 14th century. And the challenge when they started was they decided they wanted to have the base of the dome bigger than anything that had ever been built before. And they wanted it to be a freestanding dome that is no internal supports. And the reason it took 140 years was twofold. It was interrupted by a dark age, but also they had to figure out how to do this. It's kind of like the Apollo project. When John Kennedy announced it, we didn't know how we were going to do it, but we announced we were going to do it, and we did it in the time frame which he announced. Brunelleschi, the architect who discovered new physical principles and put them to work so such a dome could be built, among other things, had to educate his workforce because they're up there on these scaffolds. Again, there's no internal structures supporting this dome. And he had to educate them so they would understand why this wasn't going to fall down on their heads and they were going to die. So it's a very, very powerful picture. And as many of you saw, we use this image in inviting people to our conference because it really does represent this very much Promethean spirit. And it infuses all of Trump's best speeches. I mean, when you listen to him in the South Bronx, which wasn't his same old Trump stump speech, which we've all heard and we love, but in the South Bronx, it was Trump the builder, you know, Trump the New Yorker. And obviously the crowd of New Yorkers who you would not think were Trumpers loved it. So I want to have those ideas in mind. I want to kind of set the table. Before I turn to what many of you know I've been involved in and my friends have been involved in educating people around for many years, which is Donald Trump's Agenda 47. We have our friends from both California and Texas here who did succeed in getting resolutions of support for Trump's Agenda 47 through their state conventions in California and Texas. Yes. But, you know, when you talk about, I mean, many of you know, especially here in Michigan, you've participated in our biweekly discussions on this. When I was thinking about it, I think there's 3 ways to look at Trump's Agenda 47. The first is you don't look at it at all, by which I mean still too few people are at all familiar with the fact that Donald Trump has laid out a set of policies, many of which are absolutely revolutionary. They go beyond even what he was doing in his first administration. That's the first way of looking at it, which is not to look at it. The second way of looking at it is it's a series of issues. Discrete policy statements, there's about 40 or 50 of them, I think. If you've been to his website, he's got a 2-3 minute video on each one of these topics with a little bit of written background and so on. They cover many of the crises facing us today: cultural, economic, strategic, and so on. But I have to admit to a certain frustration, because I've been talking about Agenda 47 for over a year, and I somehow just kept getting the feeling people weren't getting it, that there's something missing when people look at this as a series of issues on critical topics. And then I realized you actually have to look at it through the worldview expressed by Trump at Davos. You have to look at this as a whole. He wants to unleash a Promethean quality which will harness fire, that is going to unleash our power over nature, which builds cities, which he certainly likes to do, and which pushes us to the stars. And look, compare this to the endless Republican and conservative talking points about the economy. It's always about money. It's never about exerting dominion over nature. And again, boy, did we exert dominion over nature with that SpaceX launch the other day. It's that kind of optimism and the need to unleash that which is human, i.e. our God-given creativity, that really, I think, makes Trump's Agenda 47 policies so revolutionary. There's another side to his Agenda 47 policies, and that is Trump's very sharp recognition of the nature of the enemy. I think he got most direct in the speech he gave not too far from here back in September when he came to Clinton Township and spoke during the UAW strike. And in that speech, he used a phrase I haven't heard him use that much, but he nailed it. He talked about the enemy as a globalist financier class. That's a really good phrase, because they're not communists, they're not socialists. Frankly, they're more like fascists, which, if you notice, Trump is using more and more and more. Globalist financier class does come pretty close to defining a key element of the oligarchy. And it's really important, because you can't defeat the enemy if you don't know who he really is. You know, if you have some kind of simple-minded slogan, he's just going to keep doing his evil behind that simple-minded slogan. Really, these people are not communists. They're much worse. They're oligarchs who hate what makes us human. They're satanic. The next slide, please. We don't have to leave it up long, because this is the recently released portrait of King Charles, which his wife says, "That's him. You caught it." And I think they did. Please take it down. Now, these people are so satanic, in fact, that they may blow up the world in order to stop Trump and to stop this Promethean character from reconquering America. People know that under the Biden administration, they're throwing caution to the winds in their provocations of Russia, and the consequence of that, as Donald Trump keeps repeating, could be World War III before the November election. Because one of the methods of the oligarchy, going back to the time of the Peloponnesian War, is to pit nations or groupings against each other. The Peloponnesian War saw the Athenians and the Spartans pitted against each other by an outside empire and they were essentially both destroyed. Nominally one won, but nobody won. And the entire post-war era, until Trump came along, has really been an exercise in those kinds of geopolitical conflicts. I mean, literally everything. Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan, the Mideast, Kosovo, the Gulf Wars, now Ukraine, and now the Mideast again. Imperial geopolitics is based on the idea that nations will be stupid and manipulable. And they've run into a problem with Donald Trump because he's not stupid and he's not manipulable and he will not play their geopolitical games because he treats every other nation in the world as a sovereign nation. We may have differences. We may have intense differences. But he treats every other nation in the world as a sovereign nation, which is why he got close to actually coming up with a treaty with North Korea. Now, the other world leader, which they hate just as much as Trump, is Vladimir Putin. And on our website, we have a post written by Mike Steger, which has got a fascinating quote from Putin, where he says, in essence, to the American people, if you reassert your anti-imperial outlook, now, he doesn't say this, but read between the lines, get rid of Joe Biden, then we can work with you. And it's not a surprise that the globalists are trying to pit these two nations against each other. So we do have to put Trump back in. And as I said, at the end of the morning session, we're going to hear about some of the hands and feet activity to do that. The second question, really for us, is will Trump be able to govern if we put him back in? And that's up to you. A lot of you, at least of my generation, remember the old Kirk Douglas movie Spartacus, where Spartacus leads the slave rebellion against the Romans, and they're captured, and the Romans want to execute Spartacus, so they call out to the captured slaves, who is Spartacus? And Kirk Douglas steps forward and says, I am Spartacus, and all the other slaves do too, so that the Romans cannot identify who the leader is, because they've all chosen to be leaders. Now, there's actually another example of this, and I'm going to get back to Aeschylus's Prometheus Bound, because there's a section of Prometheus Bound which really puzzled me the first number of times that I read it. In the middle of the goings-on, a maddened cow, who is actually a young woman who was turned into a cow, shows up at the mountain where Prometheus is chained. And it turns out she was seduced by Zeus. She was then punished and tortured by Zeus's wife and Zeus. She was turned into a cow. She was stung by flies, and she was just madly running throughout the world in agony and ends up at Prometheus's mountain. And she tells her story, and then she leaves. And I always said to myself, what is this all about in this play? I mean, on one side, it does show the evil of the oligarchy. And if if people like Jeffrey Epstein or Prince Andrew come to mind, it's probably appropriate. But it was clear there was more than that. And the more I thought about it, I realized there's an audience in the dialogue between Prometheus and Io. There's a chorus of river nymphs. There's often choruses in Greek plays. And what happens to the chorus? They see what Zeus has done to Io. And at the end of this first part of the trilogy, Zeus decides to punish Prometheus again and bring the mountain down upon him as further punishment. And the chorus decides to stand with him because they were confronted by just how evil the oligarchy was, and that you cannot be a passive observer. Now, this is the ultimate cliffhanger, because we don't have part 2 and part 3 of this trilogy. They've been lost in time. But we do know that ultimately Prometheus is unbound, and he triumphs. So we have to use our imagination to fill out how this happened, or more importantly, how are we going to do this today? How do we end the reign of the Olympian gods once and for all. And the challenge that we throw out to ourselves and to each of you is when you say, I am Spartacus, and you stand with Trump, as so many Americans and more Americans are now doing, you have to do more. You have to think like the President of the United States. You have to ask yourself questions. How do we rebuild? What do you do with the trillions of dollars in debt? If you get rid of the Federal Reserve, which some congressmen are now calling for, what do you replace it with? How do you not just stop the satanic education that's going on in our schools, but how do you recreate a classical education that unleashes that spark of creativity? And I think that if you think about these things, think about these kinds of challenges and accept that responsibility, it begins to answer the question of what happens after Trump's 4 years. We're all 24/7 in terms of ensuring his election. But with equal passion, we have to think about what comes after Election Day and what comes in the 4 years following. And the answer to that is not a person. At this moment in our nation's history, there is no other Donald Trump, just as there was not another George Washington or Abraham Lincoln. They were unique, they were needed, and they fulfilled their mission. But they also put in place institutions of the American system, of national banking. They put in place institutions which carried beyond their presidency. And we have to ensure that Trump 47 is able to do the same thing, reestablish American institutions which will carry forward into the future. Now, I want to conclude with one other comment on Prometheus, and that is his name. His name actually means forethought. Think about the future. He actually had a brother named Epimetheus. His name means afterthought. You know, kind of like when you do something stupid and you say, I should have thought of that. That's Epimetheus. I'm not sure we could even call Joe Biden Epimethean. But the American system is Promethean in this sense, to promote the general welfare for yourselves and your posterity. This is the future. I was watching coverage of Michigan Central being reopened for us Detroiters and Michiganders. We know this was a very happy event. And they were interviewing a 67-year-old lady from Detroit. And she said, you know, I hope I'm going to live another 30 years, but this isn't for me. This is for my children and my grandchildren, that we're giving them their city back for the future. And that kind of question of the future is really, I think, the most important Promethean question. So I want to counterpose that to one other evil Zeus-like figure. And Adam, if you could put up slide number 7. Because this question of being Promethean, taking responsibility for the future, this flies in the face of what many MAGA supporters, conservatives, and others actually think they believe about the economy. They think they believe in Adam Smith and his free market ideology. Now, I'm not going to read the quote for time purposes, but the essence of it is, you don't think about the consequences of your actions. You leave that to God. All you do is avoid pain and pursue pleasure. That's called profit and loss, and God's going to sort it out in the end. Again, go back to Donald Trump's Davos speech, where he talks about the future. I want to conclude with Donald Trump himself and suggest that after you watch this, this is how you defeat the globalists. Adam?
That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
fellow Americans. This week, in the company of astronauts, I was honored to sign the NASA Transition Authorization Act right into law. With this legislation, we renew our national commitment to NASA's mission of exploration and discovery, and we continue a tradition that is as old as mankind. We look to the heavens with wonder and curiosity. More than 2 decades ago, one scientist followed this curiosity and dramatically changed our understanding of the universe. The year was 1995. Taxpayers were spending billions and billions of dollars on NASA's Hubble Space Telescope. The astronomer in charge had a novel idea. He wanted to use the expensive telescope in a totally unconventional way. Instead of pointing Hubble's eye at nearby stars or distant formations, Robert Williams wanted to peer into the void. He aimed the massive telescope at one of the emptiest regions of the night sky. For 10 days during Christmas of 1995, Hubble stared into the abyss, seeking whatever light it could glean from the darkness, and it was total darkness. Fellow astronomers didn't know if he'd see much of anything, but Williams was rewarded, and the entire world was struck by the awesome images of our satellite return. In that tiny patch of sky, the Hubble Deep Field showed thousands of lights. Each brilliant spot represented not a single star, but an entire galaxy. The discovery was absolutely incredible. But the unforgettable image did not satisfy our deep hunger for knowledge. It increased ever more and even more, and reminded us how much we do not know about space, frankly, how much we do not know about life. With this week's NASA reauthorization, we continue progress on Hubble's successor, the James Webb Space Telescope. It is amazing. The Webb telescope is set to launch next year. It will gaze back through time and space to the very first stars and the earliest galaxies in the universe. We can only imagine what incredible visions it will bring. At a time when Washington is consumed with the daily debates of our nation, I was proud that Congress came together overwhelmingly to reaffirm our nation's commitment to expanding the frontiers of knowledge. NASA's greatest discoveries teach us many, many things. One lesson is the need to view old questions with fresh eyes, to have the courage to look for answers in places we have never looked before, to think in new ways because we have new information. Most of all, new discoveries remind us that in America, anything is possible if we have the courage and wisdom to learn. In the span of one lifetime, our nation went from black and white pictures of the first airplanes to beautiful images of the oldest galaxies, captured by a camera in outer space. I am confident that if Americans can achieve these things, there is no problem we cannot solve. There is no challenge we cannot meet. There is no aim that is too high. Whatever it takes and however long it will be, we are a nation of problem solvers, and the future belongs to us. We are truly a great place to be. I love America.
Thank you.
Thanks for watching. Please take a moment and subscribe to our free newsletter at PrometheanAction.com.